Welcome to Natural Recovery from Suffering. This is Scott Killaby, and I want to tell you the story of Dom and Sub. And this is a fictitious story, but there's so many people will actually relate to this story, even though I've made it kind of provocative with the sexual or the dominant submissive. Some people think of a sexual connotation. But, and I made it that way, but it's more about it's energetic. It's this Dom Sub energetic duality has been repeated throughout history over and over. Predator, prey, abuser, abused, the controller and the controlled, the oppressor and the oppressed, perpetrator, victim, dominant, submissive. This is really big if you feel this. This is not just if you hear it as some sexual thing, it's going to be a sexual story, of course, some sex in it, but don't hear it like that. It's so much bigger, and it's you. And until we embody both of those energies, we suffer. That's one way of saying. This is a way of talking about emotional repression. But I'm going to tell a story, as I sometimes do here on podcasts, that when you hear the details of the story, you can easily forget that this is about emotional repression. Because that's like the story, this is the buried story of our lives. And this is how we bamboozle ourselves at the conscious level by believing our stories and what we're seeing and hearing. All the while, it's the repression driving things. So here we go. Oh, and you can make Dom Sub male or female. They could be two men. They could be two women, could be male, female. The dominant could be the female. The dominant could be the male. I'm just going to use Dom Sub for the most part. If I have to use gender, I'll just say they're both him, but I'll try not to do that only because I don't know. I'm gay. Okay? I'm coming out of the closet after 16 years as a teacher. No, I'm not. I've already been out of the closet. But that's just going to be my reference. They're two males, but forget that and just let them be whatever gender or genderlessness that you want them to be. So Dom and Sub met when they're close to the same age, around the early 20s in college, and they were instantly a connection, like peanut butter and jelly, Dom and Sub. You know what I mean? Or Jack and Jill, or any other duality that we all know it just goes together. Like, I don't know, sex and shame, and so many other things. Let's hope that sex doesn't always come with shame for you. But Dom and Sub was just an instant match. It's like they saw each other. You are everything that I'm not. Literally. You have everything that I don't have. You show up in a way that I can't. You compliment me. And all these other cliches that would just fit perfectly here, if we kept going. But immediately what they both noticed is that Dom was let's just say Dom wore the pants. And Sub was, let's say, naked from the waist down, metaphorically speaking. And so that's how their relationship went, and they both knew it, and they both just consented to that. It actually there was no conflict most of the time, because that's Sub just played the role of Sub, and Dom played the role of Dom. It was actually quite natural, they thought. That's why they fit so nicely into those roles, because it wasn't anything forced. Their love was not something that they had to work on really in the beginning. And people would say, well, love is just so much work. And Dom and Sub would look at each other and go, no, it's not. And because they had those roles so clearly defined, that in the beginning they didn't really experience any conflict. I mean, Sub did whatever Dom said, for the most part. But Sub was given just enough freedom to buy into the illusion that he had his own freedom. Because if he really had no freedom, it just wouldn't work. And there were underpinnings or layers that, weren't obvious in the beginning. Like, for example, well, I don't want to spoil the plot, But there's a lot of spoilers coming. I mean, there's a lot of plot twists coming. So I don't want to. I was about to give one away, but let's just say no. It's just Dom and Sub, and Dom's in control, and Sub follows along. And I mean, it's in their social, their social life, their personal life, their sexual private life. It's all the same energetic relationship. I mean, like when Sub goes to the grocery store, Dom has created the list and the brands of the. It's not just get spaghetti; it's get this brand of spaghetti, and Sub gets that brand. And if Sub doesn't get that brand, he goes home and explains to Dom, "This is why I didn't get that brand, Dom. They didn't have it." Dom, I say, "Did you ask the clerk?" Sub said, "Yes, I did, because you asked me to get that, but the clerk said they didn't have it," and Dom would take that as an acceptable answer. That wasn't a problem. That was not a conflict. Sub was just doing what Sub was there to do, is get the damn spaghetti. But he couldn't. That's just how things were. Later on that evening, just to show how there was no conflict, they had some of the best sex ever. Sub just did everything Dom wanted. Just like the spaghetti. As time wore on, they were human. I mean, they're not actually Dom and Sub, and they started to be more introspective. After college, they both got into different forms of self-help and healing work, and, well, Dom wasn't so keen on the spiritual work. It's like weak. He didn't like it. He didn't want people to know that he was doing spiritual work. But he didn't mind. Some of the self-help stuff was okay. Like just the calm, assertive, dominant, that kind of thing. Anything that's very helpful for his role as a dominant, of course. But vulnerability, no. Dom wasn't interested in that at first. And Sub was not interested in anything other than kind of I don't know, you know what I mean by this, the lovey-dovey, the woo-woo stuff at first. Sub just didn't want to get into the self-help stuff, the really deep work. But he liked some of the rewards of like positive spirituality, just always having a positive viewpoint and not having any negativity. That was his first foray into self-help. But it was just interesting to see Dom and Sub exploring who they really are. And they were doing it together. But that didn't always translate to bed, as you'll find very well, as you'll find in the story later, or into any other aspect of their relationship. Because the more that they explored the question of who am I, each of them, and grew, you could say, in relationship, the less satisfied they were with the relationship and the roles and what those roles really signified about who they are and how they were showing up. Let's see what happens to Dom and Sub after college. Stay tuned. Well, other people would have things to say about Dom and Sub's relationship. Like they would say, Dom, I think you're a narcissist. That's all that you are. You're not anything different than a narcissist that you would read about on the internet. People would leave Sub alone, mostly. Sometimes felt sorry for Sub. But people had opinions about Dom, and then therefore about their relationship. But Dom and Sub would just sit there and say, well, this is what we want. What do you mean, narcissist? Sub would say. And Dom would say, yeah, what do you mean, narcissist? That's your stuff. We're just in a relationship and we're doing what we want. So they never really took that seriously. And Sub wasn't screaming narcissist. Might have been screaming sometimes, but it wasn't narcissist. And so their self-help grew into something. Sub began to explore why Sub couldn't even change the rules of the relationship. So, for example, he had some ideas about how their relationship could be different. And it didn't seem like it would break the rules too much, but Sub noticed that Sub couldn't bring it up. had difficulty even bringing up this idea to Dom. And this began to really play on Sub that this is a consensual relationship. We both agree to this. But I have this one little change that I want to make to it, but it doesn't feel like I can even bring it up. And so if this is consensual, why am I so afraid? And Sub thought about it, and thought about it, and thought about it, and never brought it up. It had to do with a few needs that Sub had. You know, like after sex, Sub wanted to be held. Dom liked to roll over. Sub wanted a little bit more affection to lead up to sex. Dom just wanted to grab Sub's head and push it down. They have different needs, it seemed, and Sub wanted to speak up and say, look, let's just change some of the rules of the game. It's consensual, but he couldn't. Could never bring it up. He also wanted to change one of the rules about going to the grocery store. I don't want to have to ask the clerk, he wanted to say to Dom. If I don't see it on the shelf, I just want to get a different brand. But he felt like he couldn't bring that up to Dom, just changing those rules a little bit. If they could both agree to these new rules, then they would have a new consensual game, a relationship. But Sub didn't feel like, he started to really question whether this was consensual. I know I love Dom. I would do anything for Dom. Literally. But I want to change the rules and I don't feel like I have any power. And then Sub became really confused. He's like, well, that's what a Sub is. It's powerless. Why is this a problem now? Why is the very thing that I want to be here in my relationship with Dom, why is this now the source of my suffering? And so Sub never brought it up. And of course, sex kept happening. And Dom kept just grabbing Sub's head and pushing it down. And every time, Sub was like, of course I want to do this for Dom, but I'm feeling something here. I'm starting to resent Dom. And afterwards, after sex, Sub would want affection, but wouldn't say anything. And Dom would roll over night after night after taking what he wanted. And there was no affection. And Sub, again, felt resentment. And when Sub would go to the grocery store, he would see that the bread that Dom wanted wouldn't be on the shelf. And he knew that if he asked the store clerk, the clerk would say, if it's not on the shelf, honey, we don't have it. But what could Sub do? Because those were the rules. Stay tuned. Well, this might seem like an unusual relationship to you, but if you think about it this way, Dom and Sub, I forgot to say this as part of the story, when they first got together, they just established boundaries, and they both agreed to them. So this is not a power dynamic issue. They both just agree to this. They're totally fine with it. And so it's not like Dom's doing anything to Sub. They both agree in the beginning that if they change the boundaries, all they have to do is one brings it up to the other, and then they change the boundaries, the rules of the game. That's all that has to happen. And Dom has always felt like, well, if Sub doesn't like any of this, I'm sure he'll say something. And those were clear boundaries, they both thought. And they lived many years with those boundaries as Dom and Sub. It was only because Sub started to get into the self-help, and Dom a little bit too, they started to question some things. And Sub started to follow those coaches who would say, find your power and your authenticity in relationship. And Sub was just starting to wonder what that would look like if in a relationship like this, in which I've agreed to submit myself to Dom. What would that look like? My power doesn't make any sense. And my authenticity, this is my power, my authenticity. This is what I want. These people, I'm not sure if they know what they're talking about. Don't they know? Don't they care what I want? Sub would think to himself. But the more he looked at it, even though he was basically in a relationship that he had agreed to these boundaries, he wanted to explore power a little bit more. What would that look like? But he was scared. He was just really scared. Because it's like that threatens the entire foundation of what I am in our relationship. I'm Sub. I can't take my power back. I don't even know where it is. And so, by the way, what are these coaches saying? How can a sub take their power back when, if they had their power, they wouldn't be a sub? That doesn't make any sense. The whole idea of being a sub is that you have to not have your power. After a while, Sub was convincing himself that doesn't make any sense at all. To have my power, then how would I be a sub? What would happen to Dom? And what would sex look like? That would just not be good. Sub was like, for a while, very against it. It's like, I don't want my sex to go away. I love being a sub in bed. And I think Dom likes being Dom. But when Sub got quiet, like in moments of honesty, he knew that he wasn't happy anymore. Even though this was the relationship he chose, and even though he didn't really totally buy into what those coaches were saying, he knew that he was suffering. So he had to listen. He had to do some exploration into this whole power thing. So the next time they had sex and Dom grabbed his head, Sub grabbed the hand of Dom. And they both just froze there. And Dom said, "You do realize you're crossing a boundary, don't you, Sub? By grabbing my hand?" And Sub said, "Yes, sir. You're right, sir." And he took his hand off of Dom's hand. And Dom pushed Sub's head down just like every other night and didn't give him any affection after. Just rolled right over, and Sub was left to weep and suffer again. Sub started to contemplate this whole power thing. Like, I don't know about just taking my power. I can't bring up that I want to change the boundaries of the relationship. I can't say that I want some choice in the supermarket. I can't say that I want some other things other than just to be treated like a doormat that you walk all over in bed, even though I love it. I want something else, even though I love it. There may be more to life than just being Sub. But when Sub looked at Dom, he didn't think that Dom had the same experience, that Dom would even care to really look outside of what it would be like to not be Dom anymore. I mean, like, he didn't think that Dom would be open to the same exploration. And that's what made him afraid to push those boundaries or bring up that conversation. He knew that he could bring it up. He could say, "Dom, I want to like to change the boundaries of the relationship." And if one or more of them brought something up, they would have to change it. But this was different for Sub. This was emotional. He was suffering. He was shut down. He couldn't bring it up. Whatever they agreed to, he couldn't do it. He felt truly powerless. It wasn't just like he agreed to be a Sub. He really felt powerless. And that's not just a fun thing that you're doing in bed anymore, or just a a relationship that used to work. This was a deep kind of powerlessness, and Sub kept trying to exert his power because he knew that that was the reason for his suffering. It was his powerlessness. He kept trying to bring it up. He would bring it up right after sex, before Dom would roll over, or he would try to. It never came out. He would cry as Dom rolled over. He would try to muster up the energy before sex to grab Dom's hand again. But he never could. He was like paralyzed, frozen, shut down. He didn't know why. It was no longer about boundaries that they agreed to or a consensual agreement or a relationship. It was like now he was trapped in a hole. And he couldn't leave, couldn't get out. He couldn't say anything. Even though one of the boundaries and rules are that you can say something, he couldn't. And Sub got angrier and angrier, but he didn't know it. It came out as shame only. And that's where the story starts to get more honest. Stay tuned. So it's at this point that I want to break the fourth wall and talk about Sub's anger, so that we clearly know, like breaking the fourth wall just means stopping and explaining facts that are not in the story so that you can understand the story from a different perspective. Or literally breaking the fourth wall in television was when an actor would look at the camera and talk to the audience. But here, when you tell stories that are based on understanding emotional repression and how it drives things to the surface, nowhere in Dom and Sub's life or story are you going to see, hear, faintly, vaguely, overtly, covertly, anger unless you're trained to see it, because he's repressed it. I mean, my God, Sub is submissive. It's literally submitting to authority and denying your own inner authority. That's what makes a Sub. And Dom and Sub here just represent anybody and everybody who takes on these roles, these power dynamics in relationship. So if you can understand that, well, again, for this relationship, this narrative, Sub is an anger repressor. Dom represses vulnerable emotions. Being dominant is safer for him than being vulnerable, which is weak. You follow me? And then Sub, it's safer for him to be Sub, to be small, than it is, he can't own his big energy or his power. So there's the subtext that you need, or the context, subcontext that you need to hear the rest of the story, or the next parts. Yeah, that's all. Oh, wait, one more thing. So along with that, I want you to understand this, because this is not something, again, unless Dom Sub are really conscious, that would really talk about, or it wouldn't come out in the story. But if you have a trained eye, you can see that Dom has a little bit more anxious attachment, and Sub has a more avoidant attachment. And okay, here's the story. Well, for Sub, this is the first time that their sex felt shaming to him, because this is a love relationship. So even though they have had this sex where Dom dominates Sub, that is not something that ever made Sub feel bad about himself, because he wanted that, he thought. But now it's different. He feels more and more shame around his role in sex and his role in life, which is the same role, to submit his authority to Dom. And shame comes to the surface and just kind of overtakes a lot of Sub's life, and then he begins to avoid Dom. It's safer just to be in shame than it is to feel and express anger or power to Dom. It's that simple. That's why his nervous system is producing the shame. Sub doesn't know any of this. He just is feeling isolated, and the chemistry isn't there, he tells himself, and he's going through the motions, and he feels shame, but he doesn't know why. And the shame is like an aphrodisiac in the bedroom because it's a different kind of sex now, because he feels like he really deserves what's happening, and that he's disgusting, that he's dirty. And then that turns him on more. But the sex is more animalistic and kind of represents the way that their life is they're disconnected. Whereas before it was much more, it was something about it that was magical for both. So it's just the repression is affecting everything. And Dom feels Sub pulling away. But with Dom and Sub having this relationship where Sub, subverts authority to Dom, that's Dom's anxious attachment never had to be dealt with. There's Sub always right there to serve his needs. But now Sub is in the other room a lot. And Dom has to call him into the room, like, I have things we have to do here. Sub is still obedient, but like his energy is reluctant. And there's like procrastination. Sub starts to procrastinate because, that's the anger, the buried anger. And it's his way of like not getting things done that he doesn't want to do. But he's not conscious of that. He just feels like, used to when Sub would say, do this. Dom would say, do this. Sub would jump. But now it's like the energy was heavy in him. He didn't want to jump. And he knew that when he was doing things like going to the supermarket, that to get things, he felt resentful. And that's different than it was before. But Sub was never overtly angry, ever, and never spoke back to Dom up to this point. At this point, Sub had given up on expressing his needs for affection and for some different things to happen in bed and in the relationship. And he was just feeling like, I just have to survive day by day. I can't leave because I don't have my power. I can't say anything because I don't have my power. I can't set boundaries. That's not part of the relationship. I can't bring up that I want a change because I don't have my power. So he feels completely identified with that powerlessness and helplessness, which then turns to a kind of depression. Well, Sub doesn't know, though, that the depression is there because it's safer than the buried anger. And so the system produces the depression, just like it produced the shame to keep Sub safe from owning the very power that would free him. Not only from whatever shackles are in the relationship, but from his own suffering. Because they're the same thing. The inside and out are one. Sub doesn't know that. He doesn't know his inside yet. He doesn't know what's at the core. And when people don't know what's at the core, they suffer. So if you were seeing Dom and Sub, if they walked into a restaurant, you would sense that Sub, it's not that he's held captive, but that he doesn't really want to be there. And that the smiles are forced, and there are micro expressions in their conversation. As Dom is talking to him, Sub is not the usual obedient responder to everything with the puppy dog eyes and the I'm willing to obey and serve, sir. It's more like he does it, he goes through the motions, but in between that, there are micro expressions that say, I hate you, fuck you, I'm angry, I gotta get away. But they're just expressions. Very quick, fleeting. If you can imagine just a smirk or a sigh or closing the eyes and cringing a little bit. And feeling really awkward or uncomfortable with a question from Dom. Where he used to just answer fluidly and easily. So this was Sub suffering in every way. If you can feel his suffering, the only thing that he gets out of the relationship at this point is the sexual gratification because of the shame that drives that. Nothing else that he can feel. His body feels cold to him on the inside and hardened more than before. Now, Sub has to start finding answers to what's going on for him, and it just isn't safe for him. He doesn't know that he has anger repression. It's not safe for him to just, get right to the root. So he focuses on something safer. He's like, oh, I think this is just really sex addiction. Because now, I fell in love with Dom, but now it's like the shame makes me want it all the time. It's the only connection I have. And I can't live without it. And that's the problem. And of course, bamboozling himself because anger repression is creating all that. He goes to an anonymous group for people with sex addiction who are married, called Strictly for Love. And the so-called guidelines, or let's call it what it is, rules of the group are not only that you can only have sex with the person that you're with, but that you can only make love. That's right. Sex has to be strictly for love within mutual, consensual, adult relationships. And anything outside of that is considered some form of addiction or distortion within the relationship that has to be dealt with through certain processes. And this just seems to hit a mark for Sub because, well, for a number of reasons. On the surface, it just sounds good. Like, well, I don't want to go outside the relationship. That's never been something. And, well, my addiction is in the relationship. And so they're talking about sex should be just for love. And that must be my problem because I'm not doing it for love. I'm doing it for something that I don't know. And maybe I can find the answer here. So it just fits Sub perfectly fine to go to Strictly for Love. But the thing about it is you have to bring your partner to the meetings. Your partner doesn't do all of the work with you, of course, but your partner has to show up and there has to be conversations at the meetings where partners speak about certain things. And the first meeting is awkward for Dom because he doesn't like vulnerability. And he's sort of a little bit disruptive in the room because you can tell that even though he's not trying to be defensive, when he speaks, it's kind of defensive. And almost like a little like, I kind of am above all this. And this is Sub's problem. And this doesn't go over well in the group. It also makes Sub feel ashamed, which is just how he feels anyway. Most of the time. But finally, after the meeting is over, Sub's interested, of course, in getting involved in this work. And he finds a sponsor there in the program. And over the course of a few weeks, Sub learns of the processes and the guidelines. And he starts to have hope that maybe the real issue is here that there is something in him, a distortion, as they say in Strictly for Love, that has to be cleared up. And that once it's cleared up, Dom and Sub will live happily ever after in a very loving, sensual, however you want to paint that, relationship. But of course it doesn't go that way exactly. Some of the exercises, you see, because the Strictly for Love is certainly not just for people like Dom and Sub. Any couple can be there. And the exercises and processes involve things like setting boundaries and expressing needs, expressing your true emotions. The things that make relationships good, actually. And so on the surface, it looks so good to Sub. He's like, well, this is what I need. Because if I can have Dom somehow hear this, that this is healthy. This is the thing that I wanted to change about our relationship. I may not have wanted to go this far with how they're talking about it, but these are some of the things I wanted to talk about. Like there can be some boundaries, some new boundaries, and then maybe some, well, I don't know, some things that they're talking about make sense to me. So he got more and more excited as he heard about this. But as he did the exercises with his sponsor, he had difficulty with the boundary setting. And he would kind of get triggered with his sponsor, who would suggest that Sub doesn't really know or have any boundaries. And Sub was really kind of just, I don't really know what you mean, but your energy, he would say to the sponsor, just feels, I don't know how to say it, it just feels like it's off with me when on this subject of boundaries, he would say to the sponsor. He would apologize, of course, for saying that, but he felt adamant that sponsor had some issue, that it had nothing to do with Sub on this issue of needing to express certain boundaries. And so Sub just skipped those chapters and kind of went through the motions and kind of remembered that setting boundaries is probably important, but if his sponsor had a problem, so he never could get the benefit of that part of the program. So then they moved to the part of the program that deals with authenticity. And his sponsor asked Sub, have you expressed your real wants and needs to Dom? And Sub said, sponsor, I don't know if I know what my real wants and needs are. So how would I express them? The sponsor asked him about his relationship with Dom. He said, tell me about a given day between the two of you. And Sub says, well, I basically do whatever he wants. And the sponsor said, Sub, is that what you want? And Sub said, I don't really know, sponsor. And the sponsor had a big issue with this and counseled him a little bit on it, gave him some exercises to do at night and some conversations to have with Dom around his wants and needs. And to actually this week, sponsor said, I want you to say one thing to Dom. Just one. I want you to express an important want or need to Dom. That you feel that Dom is not fulfilling, meeting, whatever it is, and it could be any want or need. What will it be, Sub? And Sub sat there for a moment. Stay tuned and let's find out what he says. As the sponsor asked him what that one need or want would be, Sub took a long time. The sponsor didn't even know if he'd heard the question. They were sitting in a cafe outside. There were cars going by, people talking all around them. Sub was looking all around, and eventually sponsor said, Sub, did you hear me? What would be the one want or need that you could express to Dom this week? And Sub said, to leave me alone. Just to leave me alone. And sponsor said, Sub, are you sure you want to be in this relationship? And Sub said, I don't know any of that. I didn't say that. It's something simpler. And I feel it in my body. Do you know what it is, sponsor? It's just a feeling that I want to be left alone. And the sponsor said, Sub, you should really explore that because I don't feel that way with my wife. And Sub said, maybe you just can't feel it. Maybe it's in you. or her. You just can't feel it. I mean, I don't think I'm that strange, sponsor. Maybe I'm not. Maybe I am. But this feels like a feeling that I've had all my life. How could I be that odd to have that feeling and nobody else has it? Sponsor said, this is the person that you love, Sub. When we get into relationships with people that we love, we don't want them to leave us alone. And Sub says, well, maybe some of us do. Maybe that's how we are able to continue in relationships. If they could just leave us alone, we can stay. But if they don't, we can't. And the sponsor got so confused and triggered. He's like, Sub, I don't think that you're serious about this program. I think that you might need therapy or something that this program can't offer. Because I don't think that any of us have that. I think that you should maybe go to a divorce attorney and see whether you need to be in this relationship at all. And Sub said, doesn't that require me knowing how to set a boundary, sponsor? And the sponsor said, yes, but how can I help you when you didn't pay attention to that part of the program? And Sub walked away feeling dejected, like, this isn't the program for me. And he's right. I need to go talk to somebody because this is a feeling that program never got to and my sponsor never understood. And that's a feeling that Sub felt a lot recently, is like not being heard, not being understood, even by Dom. And now by sponsor. And he had this sinking feeling in his stomach as he walked around downtown looking for a therapist that person also wouldn't be able to hear him. But he kept looking anyway because it didn't seem like there was anything else that he knew to do. So he finally found a therapist, a nice older woman, Margaret. She had her office and saw clients, maybe 2 a day, close to retirement. But she looked really wise to Sub and kind of powerful, and, Sub liked that. So when he sat down with Margaret, Margaret had questions, a lot of questions at first. And it kind of was making Sub just uncomfortable because nobody really fires questions at him like that. But he answered them. And the questions had to do with, well, Sub, are you happy in your relationship? These are questions that Sub needed like days, maybe sometimes a week to answer. But she was asking them, like, we had to answer them right away. It was like, yeah, I think I am. Yes, I don't know. Well, Sub, do you want to be in the relationship? I don't know. I just know I want him to leave me alone. I don't think you're hearing me. It doesn't seem like anybody's hearing me, he said. And the therapist said, maybe I am hearing you. Maybe we just have gotten to know each other and you don't know what it's like to be heard by me yet. And she said, Sub, I can't sit here and tell you that you're angry. Even though it's true. Because part of being angry for you is making sure that no one catches you on that. But I guess I just told you, didn't I? She said. And Sub just started presenting evidence to the contrary. Well, Margaret, I thought you were hearing me, but I just told you about my relationship with Dom, and it's like, I don't think you did. I don't think you heard anything, so let me tell you again. No, I'm not angry. If anything, Dom is angry or something is going on because I feel small. That's how I feel, Margaret. I don't feel angry. I feel ashamed. I feel like I deserve what I get. I feel anything but angry, Margaret. You're not hearing me. And you could feel the anger, like right under his voice, but you could also feel the repression, making sure it didn't come out. And Margaret said, what was that I just felt in you when you were trying to tell me something? You're almost defending yourself there for a moment. Why didn't you feel really comfortable there to defend yourself, Sub? And Sub became defensive. What do you mean that I didn't feel comfortable defending myself? I don't know what you mean, Margaret. Margaret said, I just said you were angry. And if somebody said, if I knew myself, Sub, and someone said, you're angry, Margaret, because I know that I'm not, I would very confidently let them know that. I might do it calmly, or I might have anger in that moment come up just because they're wrong, not because I was angry before that moment. It's because of how wrong they had me, and I want to let them know who I am. Just like you would want to let someone know who you are if they were doing something to you or being angry or accusing you of something that you're not doing. Have you ever thought about this, Sub? And of course, Margaret was just kind of throwing things out there to see if Sub would see any anger in his experience, or because she knew she couldn't say it to him directly, she had to get him to see it. And Sub just wouldn't see it. It's like, Margaret, even though it makes sense, some of what you say, I have all the evidence in my life to tell me that you're basically gaslighting me right now. And I couldn't imagine ever of being gaslit by a therapist. And Margaret said, is that anger there that I feel? And Sub said, no. Margaret said, why don't you feel comfortable or confident with that anger? Because it seems to be there. Why did you stuff it back down? And Sub just starts crying. The kind of cry that just, the ugly cry, where you don't even know that anyone's looking, you're not even thinking about that. It's just waves of tears and sadness. And at the end of it, the cry, he looks at Margaret and he said, do you see the tears in my eyes? I'm not angry, I'm hurt. And Margaret said, so far, Sub, it's exactly as you say. You've shown me, and maybe everybody, and yourself, everything, almost, but anger. In just the short time I've been sitting here with you, Sub, Margaret said, I've seen shame, and you've talked about it, and that's not anger. I've heard the fear in your voice. You've told me about fear, but that's not anger. I've felt your sadness and your hurt, and that's not anger. Have you ever considered that anger is behind all of that? And Sub said, why would I? Why would I think that the thing that's not there is the reason for all the things that are there? That doesn't make any sense. Margaret said, well, it wouldn't if the anger is totally buried and you just don't know it. Sub said, well, now you're asking me, Margaret, to take a leap of faith or like not trust myself. Yeah, it's kind of like you're gaslighting me again because I don't feel that. When I feel down into my body, I don't feel anger. And Margaret said, well, that's just it, though. Maybe it's that you don't trust yourself. Maybe it's not that I've been gaslighting you at all. Maybe the whole time you've been gaslighting yourself, not just in this therapy session, but maybe with yourself and everyone your whole life, and then that's the issue. And Sub was like, that feels like an attack. And Margaret said, yeah, but I don't think you're going to get angry. I'm not trying to attack you, but I just don't think you're going to get angry. And Sub said, it seems like you're trying to attack me. And Margaret said, what if that also keeps you safe from knowing that this is anger? Because me attacking you is also not you getting angry. And you not getting angry when you perceive that I attack you is also you not getting angry. So where's the anger, Sub? Where is anger? And Sub said, well, obviously it's not here, anywhere. Margaret said, well, maybe that's the point. Because it's not here anywhere, you still have it somewhere. You put it somewhere. Where do you think you put it? Sub was like, oh, he's trying to distract. Like, what do you think? I put it in my closet at home? I'm dancing with it in my back pocket right now? Being smug in his little comic relief of safety. And Margaret said, no, I don't mean that, of course. I mean in your body. And Sub said, well, then I would feel it if it was in my body. Margaret said, not if it was buried. That's exactly what emotional repression is, Sub. It's repressed. And it does drive, according to science, a lot of suffering, she told him. She said, I'm not going to tell you anymore, though. Because most people, when I tell them that, they just argue in favor of more suffering by denying it and not doing the work that it takes to see that that's in fact true, that their body would tell them that if they would do that work, or the science would too. And so I stop here usually when I'm helping people and say, I just invite them to go to another therapist. I mean, I ask them if they want to, would you like to do some work on anger repression, Sub, to see, first of all, if you have buried anger. And then if you do, we can find out if it's actually the source of the suffering. And Sub said, I think I'm going to get back with you, Margaret. Margaret said, a lot of people do. I want you to take your time. I'll be here. And Sub left that day in a really deep contemplative state, because he was actually seriously considering it on one hand and thought that she was a complete charlatan and wanted to report her to the Board of Psychology immediately on the other hand. Stay tuned. As Sub is walking home from Margaret's office, he goes by the local market, gets a few things. He's at the cash register. Has to wait in line for a little bit. And he sees this magazine. On the cover it says, mindfulness is good for insomnia. And then lower down it says, emotional repression is found to be a major contributing factor to disease. Sub thinks to himself, that's a coincidence. That therapist is full of shit. In fact, I just don't like authority, and that's probably what this is about. That in the end, I'm giving over my power to some quack therapist, and I just happen to see something in the supermarket. As he checks out, he's walking home and he's thinking, but I remember when I bought a car once, and I never had a Volkswagen, and I bought a Volkswagen, and then I never remember seeing a bunch of Volkswagens, but then after I bought that Volkswagen, I kept seeing Volkswagens everywhere. Geez, I hope it's not like that. And then he started thinking, well, what if I just hide this from myself? What if he's right and it's buried and I wouldn't go looking for the Volkswagens? If I had buried anger, I would hide from it. Maybe he's right. So he walks into the library. And this is one of those like newfangled libraries that most of it's like on the internet, and they show you how to these fancy search engines that get you right to through AI, right to what you want. It's a very new modern thing. And he walks up to it and he starts to use it, and he searches for emotional repression linked to disease, and he finds study after study after study after study. And it just keeps going, page after page after page. Conclusions. It's linked to this disease, linked to that disease, to this disease, to premature death rate, to chronic pain, to spinal stenosis, to, and the list goes on, cancer. And he's blown away. But he wants to be right. And he's feeling still a little bit self-righteous, and he wants to make sure that there must be something about the therapist's hypothesis that's just completely off. And he notices that there's nothing on here about addiction or sex, because that's what his problem is that he's feeling shame about sex, and that's the only thing that's good about his relationship. So he starts reading about that in the search engine, and he finds that, oh my God, emotional repression linked to addiction has even more studies. And then emotional repression linked to that depression that he felt for a while. And then some studies on shame. And it's like a monster that had always been around him, creeping in the shadows all around him, crept up closer and closer and closer the more that he read. And he had an epiphany that this is what's happening for me. I'm angry, but I don't know it. I'm in all these studies. So the next day he goes back to Margaret's office, and he's so excited, and he's supposed to tell her, you were right, and I don't like to admit that because I don't like authority. And Margaret says, I wanted to talk to you about that. Because when you told me about your relationship with Dom, I thought, Sub, I wonder if he has subverted, or I should say, given up his own inner authority with Dom. That you have, Sub. Have you done that? Do you think that you're with Dom because you've repressed anger your whole life, and you've been doing that with a lot of people, maybe with your dad and others? You submitted to them. You subverted your authority. You gave it up. You repressed it. And that's your anger, Barry. That's your power. And that's why you had a problem with me, and that's why you're with Dom. And do you think that could be the case, Sub? And Sub said, I have no idea what you're talking about. I just know I don't really like authority. It's a feeling in my body. And Margaret said, can I take you into that feeling with a process, Sub? Sub said, yes. And he got quiet as Margaret gave some instructions to pull up some memories of Dad yelling. And took him into the unconscious where it said, don't get angry. You can't. Don't show anything. Don't show anything. Don't do anything. Just do what he says. Do what he says, do what he says, do what he says, do what he says. And Dom felt a big release during that session. He never felt anything like that. He went into shame and depression and all the things that Sub had felt, and he saw the link to the buried anger in every situation. He felt such a change in his body that he knew that he was now ready to go and talk to Dom. And Margaret said, I don't know if you're ready to talk to Dom. I'm not telling you to do it one way or another, but what is it that you want or need from Dom? And Sub thought to himself, somebody asked me that before. What do I want or need from Dom? And he sat with it for a while. He said, I need him to leave me alone. Like I've said, that's all I know. And Margaret said, would you be willing, until you come back to see me, to not tell Dom to leave you alone? But come back if you would, just in a few days. I don't want you to wait too long, Margaret said. And Dom was kind of confused by it, but he took her suggestion. He went home. He came back a few days later. The first question was, Margaret, why did you tell me? I wasn't going to necessarily tell him to leave me alone. I don't have the balls to do that. But why did you say don't do that? And I said, well, we've just started together, Sub. And I know that that's what you want. Because you told me. But we've also discovered that you're angry. And you don't want to show him that, do you? And Sub said, no, I don't. Of course, I don't know. I wouldn't even know how to show anger to Dom or to you or anyone. And Margaret said, well, what if you wanting Dom to leave you alone is the same thing as the anger repression like everything else was that you saw? And I just didn't get a chance to work with you on it. That's all. I just wanted a chance to work with you, and then you can do whatever you want with Dom. And Sub said, yes, but I just don't see how this is connected to buried anger. And Margaret said, but don't you want to know? Because this is what you came here with. And you've seen a lot of that stuff as just buried anger. But let's try and look at this. Come on, Sub. And Sub sat down and they went into the same process. And they brought up that feeling, leave me alone, from the unconscious. And he felt it in that same area where he found buried anger before. And right under that leave me alone was just rage for Dom. Just pure rage. And pure rage for Dad. And it just kept coming and coming and coming, and energy was transmuting in his body, and he was releasing so much energy. And then going into how he couldn't express it to anybody. Couldn't express it to Dad, this rage, couldn't express it to Dom. And that how he found Dom, he sought Dom out because of the rage. So that he could hold it back and be small. And suffer. And hide it from himself. And that leave me alone didn't mean, Dom, leave me alone. It meant, Dom, I'm angry at you and I can't express it. And I need you to leave me alone because of that. I'm afraid. Not necessarily of you, Dom, but of me. And Margaret said, see, that's your power, isn't it? You're afraid of you. You hold your power back. See that, Sub? And Sub said, what do you want me to do? Get angry at Dom? And Margaret said, no. Just realize that you already are. Don't you think that Dom would want to know? She said. Sub said, that's never been anything that we could ever talk about or even think about in our relationship. Me getting angry. And Margaret said, I think now, Sub, maybe you're not hearing me. I said, we both already discovered that you're already angry. Sub said, yeah, I guess I am resisting that, aren't I, Margaret? And they had a little laugh, but there was an air in the room. There was a feeling that Sub had that there's still, even though I know that this is the root of the suffering, there's still no way out. And he said that to Margaret, that Margaret, you've been the wisest person I've ever met. You've helped me more than anyone. You've taught me the truth of this. You've freed me from so much, but you can't free me from this. And Margaret said, from what? From this fact that this feeling of leave me alone also has with it a feeling that I need Dom. And you can't free me from that. No therapist can free me from that. I know that. And I guess you're going to tell me, Margaret, that that's just me sabotaging myself. And Margaret said, no, I'm not going to tell you that at all. I'm going to agree with you. No therapist can help you with that. Nobody can help you with that, really. And Sub said, well, I don't think I like that answer, Margaret. I mean, you're a therapist. You're supposed to show me how my thinking is off and how that, creates problems in my life. Margaret said, well, I think if you thought that I could make that go away, then that may be creating the problem in your life. You said yourself, Sub, that you don't have any power. Sub said, yes, what's that have to do with it? Well, you're saying right now that I'm going to have to do that and I can't do it. And you can't do it. I'm a therapist and I can't do it. And that really makes you powerless, doesn't it, Sub? And Sub started to get agitated with that comment, but he didn't know why. He felt like a rat caught in the cage but stuck in the corner because he's scared. He doesn't know where to go with this one. So they, in the session at that point, Margaret gives him a few things to contemplate and a choice to make. She said, now that we've done that work, Sub, you can go and say whatever you want. I never tell my clients what to say or not to say because that would get in the way of their own authority and their power. And Sub said, I think I understand what you're saying, Margaret, that if anyone's going to deal with this, it would have to be me. And Margaret said, unfortunately, yes, but I'm here to help you with that. And we'll talk about that more later when you come back. Sub walked home. He felt better about the whole thing. At the same time, he felt like, well, I can't do anything about this because I want to be with Dom. I need him. And I want him to leave me alone. And I can't afford to keep going back to the therapist and doing those sessions. I would have to keep going back. I mean, I can't do it on my own. I'd have to learn how to do what she does. And she went to school and she's almost retired. She's an expert. And then Sub felt that feeling of powerlessness again that Margaret talked about. And he wondered in that moment, is she right? Am I just doing this to myself? I just created the shame somehow, and then the depression and the powerlessness. Is that what she's showing me now? He went to sleep that night after sex. He didn't say anything, didn't ask for any needs, didn't speak anything after sex, and went back to Margaret's office the next day and was kind of interested in exploring a little bit more this idea that he might be creating the powerlessness. He kind of had that insight on his own and he wanted to check back with Margaret. Margaret, I think I see what you're saying. I mean, I picked Dom. Margaret said, yes, you did. And she said, well, do you know why you chose him? Sub said, not really. I mean, I have my story. We fit together so well. He had what I didn't have. But now I'm learning that I might have chosen him for another reason. And Margaret said, well, what is that reason? And Sub said, to make sure that I never have my power. Margaret said, what do you think you would get out of that? Sub. He said, love. And that day, Sub became open to learn that process that she was doing with him, and he started to do it every day in his relationship with Dom. And the changes that started to happen really started to be both good and bad in the relationship with Dom. And it started to sort of force Dom to make some changes, sometimes very uncomfortably. Stay tuned. Well, I'm going to get to the changes that happen in the relationship, including Dom. Because when one person transforms in a relationship, the other person is forced, whether they realize it or not, to respond differently. The same patterns don't work. Well, before we get there, I'm just going to break the fourth wall again on Sub's experience. This is the kind of thing that I see all the time in KI, is people come here. I just had a meeting the other day with people becoming curious about this work. And, I've got a room full of people on Zoom, and they clearly can't see yet where their suffering is coming from. They have a lot of ideas about it, but they don't know yet how to trust their body to determine exactly where it's coming from. That's what Sub is learning. That's what people learn when they come to work with us. But there's this whole process, and the process is different for everyone, but there's a process that people go through to be deconditioned from the bamboozle, is what I call it, where we literally don't see that we're doing it to ourselves, as Sub said. Meaning, the things that Sub is experiencing, shame, dejection, depression, disconnection, these are all manifestations of emotional repression. And really all the suffering in Sub's life is. But he can't see it because the anger is buried. And so he's going through this process of discovering and coming out of denial. That's really what it is. It's coming out of denial in the mind and then coming down and reversing the repression. So you're seeing him go through this process. Now, as I take you back into the story, there's changes going on. So, this can drag out. I mean, it's a long podcast episode because this is the human life. These are the lives that we live. I can't tell these stories briefly because they just unfold and we bypass and we miss things and we live unconscious lives. And if we're lucky, we discover that we're creating our own suffering from the emotional repression level. And that's what Sub's about. Well, as a result of earnestness and maybe luck in finding Margaret, Sub is about to discover, while processing on his own, so that's the context for this next segment, he's processing anger when he goes home on little things. So this is what I say to anger repressors who are afraid to express anger. It's about the little things. Saying, for example, no, or I don't want to do that, or can you please not say that way? I mean, you might find out that the things that you have to say are things that you're identified with, or that your beliefs, and that you're suffering because of the things that you have to say. But if you don't say them, if people don't express their needs in relationship, now I want you to think about this. Sub isn't expressing his needs. So it's a setup for both of them. But you can't see that at the surface because we're all like this. Well, those of us who repress anger, we often don't express ourselves because anger repression is self-repression. And so in a relationship, just like Sub, we won't express our needs and wants. Sub isn't saying that he wants affection. He isn't saying that he wants foreplay, affectionate foreplay before their Dom-Sub thing. He's not saying that he would like to do the supermarket a little bit differently with a little bit more freedom. He's just not saying things. Very classic avoidant type behavior, but really anger repression is what I see. Not that hurt or sadness repressors are really good about expressing their needs, but if you have a more anxious attachment, or you're afraid of getting hurt or left or abandoned, you might express your needs more to your partner out of the anxiety, not because you're clearer, because all attachment styles and people have fear of intimacy as long as they have repression. And so there's so much that we don't know about Dom and Sub here. We're learning about Sub. You may have guessed that Dom is a hurt repressor, or maybe I said that. It's probably obvious because he's got that big energy. You know a lot about Sub. Hopefully you see that his is coming from anger repression. And then now as Sub goes back in, he's processing anger every day. Something happens that's also very common. As Sub starts to get deeper into not only that using the sex with Dom, because he can't express himself yet. There's shame with the sex with Dom, and now he's going to go deeper into porn up in his room. So I want you to envision their house. When I tell stories, sometimes I envision these people. So this is what I'm envisioning, is that this is a gay couple, mid-30s at this point, living in like Savannah, Georgia, in a really big, like old, smaller plantation-style house, white, with kind of gaudy shutters, but inside, after you walk onto the big porch, inside is just this beautiful crown molding and wooden stairs and properly gayified, and I'm gay and I don't mean that as a derogatory thing. I mean, look, there's a joke that says if you get gay people to move in to your neighborhood, your property values go up. And it's kind of true. So I envision that. And then there are these personalities in there, these two people in this house. They don't have kids. And there's a real disconnection. And if you look at the wooden stairs, go up to their bedroom on the left, but there's going to be a room on the right where Sub's going to be hanging out a lot and has hung out a lot during his disconnection. He's going to be on the computer as we go back into the story. So Sub is getting into porn. And he's really getting into some really taboo stuff, or edgy, meaning not just like BDSM, which is something that he's very accustomed to, aggressive sex or power dynamics, but he's getting into like rape fantasies and being really hurt, like he's the one that's being hurt, or he identifies with a character who's being hurt in the porn, and he searches for the best image. The most shocking, the one that turns him on the most, and he's deeply ashamed of this. And he never would want Dom to see this because they don't do this stuff at all. He doesn't really know how to put this porn in his relationship. You might think that since they have such a, whatever you think about their relationship, that Sub could just go in and say, well, look what I'm watching. But it's not like that, because people live with shame even in very open relationships, or I don't even know if this is open, alternative lifestyles. People have shame, and it's just driving him like an aphrodisiac, basically, like it often does for people. And he doesn't know where it's coming from. And he doesn't understand why he's frantically searching for certain images. That's his trauma. It's just a self-attack, a submitting of his authority and his power, and being aggressively abused and attacked. And his particular repression has gotten to a pretty toxic place. And he starts asking Dom, instead of getting angry or expressing what's real for him, he starts asking Dom to treat him worse, humiliate him. And this is uncomfortable for Dom, because their sex has always been about just control and domination and rough sex, but never humiliation, never degradation. And Sub seems to be into that, and Dom doesn't know how to take that and feels awkward. But Sub has this divide within himself that he discussed with Margaret. He wants Dom to leave him alone. That's programming in his body connected to his anger repression. Also very common with an avoidant attachment is having that conditioning in the body that says, get away, get away. I have to get away, or they need to leave me alone. That's how people protect themselves. So he's running on that programming, which is like, get away from Dom, but also I need him. That programming is in his body. And in KI, we call that a double bind. So he's operating on this double bind where he needs Dom's love, and he also needs Dom to treat him, to humiliate him at this point, his trauma. And he's afraid. He wants Dom to leave him alone. See, there's that double bind. I need you. I'm afraid. And so that's what's driving into like this fear, this shame state, really, because he can't meet these needs that he has. He doesn't even know what they are, and he keeps trying to meet them through the porn and through the sex. But he's processing the anger, but he's afraid, and he knows that it's bubbling up. And he goes back to Margaret because he's confused, because he thinks, well, this isn't really working, because I'm feeling more shame than ever, Margaret, and you keep telling me that it's anger. And even though I do the process and I find the anger in the shame, when I come out of the process, it's shame. It's shame when I'm on the computer. It's shame when I'm with Dom. It's shame everywhere. And Margaret said, well, okay, though, but go back into your inquiry. Feel into your body. Sub, what do you get out of being shamed? See what your body says. And Sub sat there for a moment in quietness in her beautiful office, waiting for the answer. He felt his stomach tighten. He said, it protects me. It protects me, Margaret. Clearly, but I don't know from what. And she said, this is a lot like coming out of denial, isn't it? Because you've been processing anger every day, haven't you? Sub said, yes. But I think I'm just trying to stay safe from Dom or something. And Margaret said, maybe. And again, I can't give you the answer. But I want you to go home and continue to process what you found. What have you found to be the most core feeling that you hold back, Sub? And he said, anger. But why do I feel shame all the time? She said, I can't teach you. You have to keep processing why it's safer to feel shame than it is to feel and express what's true to Dom. So he walks home and he's kind of upset with Margaret because he doesn't like it when she's telling the truth because it hurts, but he likes it. It's like that's another double bind. He has it with all authority in a way. I like what she has to say and I don't really like her. He goes home and he realizes I like Dom and I don't like him. And he comes to realize this is really about anger. And so after being on the computer for hours that night, he doesn't feel like having sex. But he goes into the bedroom and Dom's awake. And Sub comes to the side of the bed. And Dom puts his hand right on his head. And Sub puts his hand on Dom's hand to stop him. And they just sit there, frozen. Sub, what are you doing? And Sub said, I don't want to be a slave anymore. I'm angry. I'm angry at you, but I'm really angry at my dad. And I've been angry at both of you for so long and I couldn't face it. If I sit here and do this, if I don't express what I need and want here, I'm going to end up hating you, Dom. And I love you, but I also hate you. And this upset Dom because he doesn't take to bad mouthing like that or back talking. That's why he is with Sub, that he wouldn't do that. And he gets angry and angrier and angrier. And Sub gets angry. He says, I'm not going to back down. If I do, I'll suffer. Dom, even if we have to break up, I'm going to keep telling you how I feel. I want affection. You don't give me any. You roll over. And I need that from you. I'm hurting. And he ebbed and flowed between anger and hurt. And it was all very real for him. And Dom, he just stayed in anger. because he couldn't go to the hurt. But after it was over, they were both changed. Because once Dom got over his anger, he sat in bed before rolling over, and he thought to himself, I think I like that part of Sub. He couldn't put words to it. He just knew that there was something about that part of Sub that he showed tonight that he liked. He didn't know if he should tell Sub that because he didn't want to argue and fight, but he knew that it was okay that Sub was angry because it felt real. And Dom started to want to feel something real. He too was not satisfied but couldn't face it, that he was playing a role, that he was holding something back, that this wasn't who he was. And this continued, this cycle. Sub didn't just do what Dom said anymore. He had his own viewpoints. Sub, go to the store and get that bread. I don't feel like it right now, Dom, but I'll go later. And there wouldn't be a fight. Because for some reason, Dom liked that part of him. It was different. But he felt like they were somehow more connected. He couldn't put his finger on it. I mean, eventually, of course, in the story, Dom's going to go do some work on himself so that he can open to what it is that holds him back. And they're going to live happily ever after. Because that's how I want to tell the story. But if I can just leave the story now that I've told it again and tell you that, honestly, these stories don't often end this way. Happily ever after. Although I will tell you what I see is when one person changes in a relationship, the other person is forced to respond differently, as I said. So that's a real thing that I've seen. And that's all I'm going to say. That when someone transforms deeply at the repression level, the people around them are forced in a way to respond differently. Because the person who's getting clearer will not sort of just be inviting those same trauma responses from people. Because they're clearer. And so everyone around them sort of has to respond differently. And that can be painful for people, and it can be confusing for people around someone who's doing that deep work, who's changing, because these roles and identities are coming from repression, and everybody is getting something out of it. So let me go back and just say a few things before I go about what Sub was getting. He was getting love and approval out of holding anger back. He was suffering, but that was keeping him safe from the anger from which he could get love and approval. This is how it is. Even though we're suffering, we're getting something out of it, and that's why it takes us so long to end suffering, because we're getting something out of it. And until we come out of denial about what we're getting out of it, what we're getting out of it is the same thing as our suffering. We're being false in order to stay safe and get love. That's our suffering. Because our suffering comes up because we hold back what's true to stay safe and get love. Thank you for listening. And if this story didn't turn you off, I think my audience is pretty mature and didn't get sort of turned off by the subject matter. Again, I think that if you take a look, these two are not very different than a relationship dynamic that I see all over the world between hurt repressors and anger repressors who do not know that that's what's driving their suffering in their relationship together. So if this is you, if you're one of them, or if it's both of you, you and your partner, and you're interested, you can always go to repressiontest.com, take our repression test, and that adds you to our newsletter. What that does is it gives you some time to get to know us better and to learn about the services that would help you the most. Everybody comes in a different place. And then if you're ready to just start the work with a mentor or learn it on your own, I'm going to put goodies in the description of every podcast episode so that those people who are following along, quite a few people are listening, can just go straight there and check it out and start the work. Thank you for listening.